Hello and welcome to the Chalke Valley History Show on Tuesday the 23rd of June. Well, we've got another packed show for you today. We've got Suzannah Lipscomb talking about the Tudors. We've got Saul David talking about the bloody bitter Battle of Okinawa in 1945 at the very end of the Second World War. We've got living history, we've got spot history, and once again we're raiding the archives.
Aside from my soul, there goes a sight, there goes a sight. Now there goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight from my soul.
And throughout this week you can contact us on social media here.
Hello, I'm Tracy Chevalier, and I was really looking forward to coming to Chalke Valley Festival this year to talk about Winchester Cathedral. I'm going to give you a couple of snippets here to tantalize you so that maybe you'll visit Winchester Cathedral yourself when you can. I wanted to write a novel about a cathedral, and I chose Winchester because it has some wonderful stories attached to it. I went down to Winchester to do some research and looked around, and I discovered these wonderful cushions and kneelers in the choir stalls of Winchester Cathedral. And here's a picture of me sitting on those very cushions. The reason I liked them so much is because they're what they call little historic medallions, scenes depicting the history of England seen through a prism of Winchester. And two of my favorites I'm going to share with you now are stories that I really loved about Winchester anyway and might well have written as a novel. But instead I wrote about the cushions which were made in 1930s by a group of volunteer women, embroidered, and they're still there. You can still sit on them, you can kneel on them, and you can learn a lot of history from them. So the first one I really loved is what we're showing you now. It is a depiction of Oliver Cromwell's soldiers in 1642. You can see the date there. They took over, during the English Civil War, they took over the cathedral as stables. And the story is that they rampaged through the building, and there are mortuary chests of bones of kings and queens. They opened them up, they took out the bones, and they threw them through the great west window, which is huge stained glass, very beautiful. It depicted the lives of saints. And the townspeople gathered up the shards and hid them away. And with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, they restored the window as well. But they didn't restore it to the lives of the saints. If you go in there today, you see it all higgledy-piggledy. It doesn't have any sort of pictures. And it's a reminder of the fragility of our faith and of our lives. And this wonderful cushion depicts that beautifully. You can see the date 1642. There's a skull, there's a femur, there are shards of glass all over the place. And I thought, well, now that it's in a cushion, I don't need to write about it. The second story I really loved that I was thinking about writing a novel about is that in the early 20th century, there were cracks began to appear in the walls of the cathedral. And it was built on very soggy foundations. And in fact, the crypt now still floods very regularly. In 1905, they hired a diver named William Walker, and he single-handedly dived for 5 years into underneath the foundations with sacks of concrete and shored up the building, and that's why it's still standing today. And the cushion depicts, it says 1905 to 1912, has this wonderful old diving costume, and I really love that. And it's particularly poignant because William Walker died of the Spanish influenza epidemic pandemic in 1918, so we remember him here. Those are a couple of reasons why you should visit Winchester Cathedral. They are it's a wonderfully historic place. So I wish you well, and I hope you go and look at those cushions. Bye.
The Tudors are unquestionably the most important and significant dynasty in British history. They may have ruled for only 3 generations and a mere 118 years, but they fundamentally shaped our sense of our national identity. One of the key innovations of the Tudor era was the establishment of a standing navy. For the first time, Britain became an island fortress rather than an adjunct to mainland Europe, and this was mainly Henry VIII's doing. This is the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, launched just 2 years after his accession. It saw active service until 2 years before the end of his reign. And then, catastrophe happened. On the 19th of July, 1545, Henry VIII came down to Portsmouth to survey his fleet in action against the French in a fierce battle that was raging in the Solent. The French had attacked with a fleet of 324 ships. Far more ships than the later famous Spanish Armada. It was the greatest foreign threat of Henry VIII's reign. In the midst of the fighting, the English flagship started to sink. She'd either been hit by French cannon or, more likely, was overladen with crew and guns. The great weight overbalanced her. 500 men went down with the ship. Henry VIII watched on helplessly. For years afterwards, the tops of her masts could be seen at high tide. A grim reminder of the tragedy. But despite the loss, Henry VIII's navy had managed to see off the invaders. England's place in the world was becoming increasingly important, and that was largely as a result of its increasing maritime influence. This book of accounts from the year 1514 charts exactly what Henry VIII was spending on his navy, and it's seriously impressive. We have these lists of names and these lists of payments made, and this is a crucial change because before this point, ships had really not been that important and hadn't been repaired. Henry VII had left between 5 and 7 ships to his son, but when Henry VIII died, he left a navy of 57 ships. This map from the 1540s or 1550s shows exactly why England was becoming so strategically important. It wasn't locked within Europe, but it was on the edge, facing out towards the New World. That New World was so new, they hadn't even discovered all its contours yet. But England was in a prime place to make the most of that opportunity. After the loss of Calais in 1558, the Tudors turned their attentions to that new world. It's under the Tudors that we see the circumnavigation of the globe by Sir Francis Drake, that we see Raleigh sending men to Virginia, the beginning of the East India Company, and Dr. John Dee claiming that there could be such a thing as the British Empire. Empire was first pursued by the Tudors. It was financed by the Tudors. It was a Tudor enterprise. But it didn't end with the dynasty in 1603. In fact, it continued for the next 400 years, through the Napoleonic Wars and the 2 World Wars. all around me is that legacy. Behind me is the world's most famous ship, HMS Victory, and Portsmouth is still home to the modern Navy, all of which was possible because of the programme of expansion that was first embarked upon by the Tudors. Of course, that's not the only impact of the Tudors' empirical legacy that's still with us today. When Henry VIII stood here in 1545, watching the Mary Rose go down, it was as the king who'd already cemented another pivotal part of national identity. This was the king who, in the Act of Supremacy in 1534, had broken with the Church of Rome, creating the Church of England, and cutting England off from Europe, both politically and spiritually. The Navy, Empire, the creation of an outward-looking, cosmopolitan, maritime nation. The Church of England, Protestantism, extraordinary architecture, literature and art. The Tudors planted and watered the seeds of those things that make Britain Britain. The Tudors were the dynasty that made us.
Well, that film with Susie Lipscomb was actually filmed way back in 2013. It's amazing to see how her career has flourished since then. Next up, though, is Professor Saul David. He's an old friend of mine and a very old friend of the festivals too. And he's talking about one of the most bitter and brutal battles of the Second World War, and one that actually was one of the very last of the war as well, against Japan, starting on April the 1st, April Fool's Day, 1945.
Well, one of the most astonishing acts of bravery that I've come across in any period of history in my 20 years of writing took place during the Battle of Okinawa at the so-called Hacksaw Ridge. That was actually a feature known as the Maida Escarpment. It was being assaulted by American troops. The battle for that particular feature had already been going on for about a week, maybe 10 days. We're getting a little bit closer to the end game in the sense that the Americans are making a little bit of progress along the top of the ridge. But during one particular attack, they're driven back off it with a Japanese counterattack. Now, in the course of that withdrawal, a lot of wounded men are left on top of the ridge. Now, the natural reaction for those soldiers was to get off the ridge as quickly as they could to save their lives. But one man stayed. And that man was a 26-year-old Seventh-day Adventist called Desmond Doss from Lynchburg in Virginia. He had joined up with the determination not to kill. That was his religious belief. And so he joined the medical teams, the naval medical teams, who were attached to the army in Okinawa. And his job, of course, was to save lives, not take them. And he felt that so strongly that even though there was a very high likelihood, in fact, an almost certainty that he would be killed if he stayed on that ridge, he stayed there. So what did he then next do? Because with a lot of wounded men, how do you get them off the ridge? Well, the quickest way to get them off, given that it was relatively steep, not quite as steep as portrayed in the film Hacksaw Ridge, but nevertheless a steep drop of about 40 feet, he decided he needed to use a rope. If he used a rope and used 2 bowline knots, which he had learned as effectively as a Boy Scout in his teenage years, he would be able to lower these guys off. The problem he's got, of course, is this is going to take time. And meanwhile, if the Japanese have any kind of inkling that there is no one defending the top where he is, they're just going to roll over the top and kill him and kill everyone else there. Fortunately, that doesn't happen. But for 5 long hours, he sweats and exhausts himself, dropping one wounded soldier after another, determined not to leave a single man wounded on the top of that slope. And he eventually gets, we think, up to 75. He, in typical modest fashion, felt it was probably more like 50. The original estimate said 100, so they settled for 75. And that was the figure that's gone down in history, and that's the figure that was in his citation. And he won a Medal of Honor for that, the highest award the Americans can give their servicemen, the equivalent of our VC. And I've never come across a soldier in war who deserved it more. The important thing to remember about the decision to attack Okinawa is nobody knows what's going to happen next. So, of course, the war in Europe is almost over, but the war in the Far East has a long way to run, or at least that was the perception. Okinawa is seen as a stepping stone for the invasion of Japan proper. You've effectively had two axes of advance through the Pacific, one through the middle of the Pacific and the other up through New Guinea and the Philippines. That was the advance that MacArthur's troops were following. Nimitz was coming through the Central Pacific, and they both meet at the island of Okinawa, and this is going to be the final stepping stone before the attack on Japan proper. The attack on Japan itself is probably going to take up to 2 million men. That was the estimate for the plans that were put in place. So Okinawa is a very important campaign, and they know, that is, the planners know, that because it's the first time they've got to a major chunk of Japan proper, albeit away from the home islands, but it was the most southerly of the prefectures of Japan at that time, the very fierce resistance which they've encountered all the way through the Pacific is going to ramp up even worse. So the plan is to land about 180,000 combat troops on the island. They hope they're going to take the Japanese by surprise by picking a bit of the island they might not expect they're going to land in. That was not the case. The Japanese knew exactly where they were going to land, but the Japanese themselves had devised a strategy which was quite unusual at this stage of the war, which was not to confront the troops as soon as they landed. Their plan was, because they had many fewer troops, they had about between 100 and 110,000 combat troops on Okinawa, which is actually a lot for those islands, but nevertheless against the force arrayed against them, not just the soldiers, but of course the sea power that this huge fleet of 1,300 vessels was going to bring into play. And because there were so many American aircraft carriers, and they eventually got hold of airfields on the island themselves, the Americans pretty much enjoyed air superiority as well. So what were those Japanese going to do to try and hold on to the island as long as possible? They were going to dig themselves into this incredibly formidable structure of defenses in the bottom third of the island, up to 60 miles of underground tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, ridge lines that could fire in both directions. So even when you took one ridge and you were trying to move on to the next one, there was a good chance you're going to be shot in the back. It was an attempt to create an attritional form of warfare that would so exhaust the Americans, they may consider, while at the same time losing so many ships to kamikaze attacks, that it's worth some form of negotiated peace, by which Japan, who you might have thought realized they'd lost the war at this point, they absolutely did not realize they'd lost the war at this point. They didn't believe it. They thought if they could bloody the American nose enough, there was a chance they could leave the war without unconditional surrender. The Japanese strategy at this stage of the war is really to use air power against the American fleet. They feel that if they can knock out enough American ships of the 5th US fleet that's assaulting Okinawa, they can force it to withdraw. And if it does withdraw, then the troops that have already been landed can, in the words of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, be mopped up by the Japanese troops on the ground. It was hopelessly optimistic, and it shows you just how deluded the Japanese high command had got at this point. And yet, on the other hand, these were desperate times. And the kamikaze, who'd really only been operating in any kind of official or organized way since the end of 1944, the late campaign, were actually reached their apogee during the Okinawan campaign. And what sort of numbers are we talking? Well, 2,000 sorties were made by kamikazes. Each one of those planes loaded with either a 250 kilogram or 500 kilogram bomb, and the intention is to fly it directly into an American warship. The reason the Japanese weren't as successful as they hoped they would be at Okinawa is because the Americans had actually put together quite an effective early warning system, this chain of destroyers and radar ships all the way around the island and round the US 5th Fleet, that not only would warn when the planes were coming in so the Americans could put up planes to combat them, but also attracted, and this was probably deliberate, attracted those planes to the destroyers. And of course the destroyers were much more expendable than the real target for the Japanese, which were the aircraft carriers and the battleships, but particularly the aircraft carriers. And if I was to tell you that not a single aircraft carrier is sunk, although a number of them were hit, it would give you an indication that the actual campaign was unsuccessful. And yet, nevertheless, 36 US ships are sunk and over 300 are damaged during this attack. And so, you know, of the original massive armada of 1,300, a sizable chunk of it has actually been damaged by the kamikaze. They weren't ineffective in the sense that they did get through, but they certainly didn't have the effect that the Japanese would hope they would have. The Americans land on the 1st of April 1945, which also happens to be Easter Sunday, and it also happens to be the birthday of Buckner's father, Buckner being the American general, and he thought this was a very auspicious date. Now, on that day, they land unopposed and make quite a lot of ground, much more ground than they're expecting to. And Buckner writes in his diary, "We've taken them by surprise. You know, we've got them on the run. They had their opportunity to defeat us. They haven't taken it, and now it's one way. It's going to be one-way traffic." How wrong was he? Of course, the Japanese had planned not to oppose those landings. They had dug these positions in the bottom third of the island, and it was just a question of when the Americans were going to get there. So probably on day 5 or 6, the Americans move in 2 directions. They go north with the Marines and they go south with the army troops. And on about day 5 or 6, those army troops begin to come up against the first layer of opposition. And it's getting through those layers, one after the other, after the other, after the other, that is going to produce this absolute horror show of a battlefield. Why was it so horrific? Well, partly because of the nature of the ground. It was very tough ridge lines, one ridge line followed by another, this coral rock that was incredibly hard to dig into. The Japanese had spent the previous 9 months digging into this rock, so they had created some very formidable positions. But if you just wanted to dig a foxhole in a hurry to protect yourself, it was almost impossible to do that. You literally had to pile up rocks, a bit like you might in Afghanistan. And as a result of that, shrapnel, and the Japanese had an awful lot of artillery on Okinawa, much more than they had in a lot of their other island campaigns, was incredibly destructive. But it was really the nature, the close-quartered nature of the fighting that took its toll on the American servicemen and that made it such a difficult campaign to fight in. The double whammy of the nature of the rock formation on Okinawa was that not only could you not dig into it to defend yourself, but if a shell hit it, even if a bullet hit it, it created fragments and shrapnel that was just as destructive as pieces of metal itself. So certainly for the Americans advancing, this was an incredibly hostile terrain to fight over. Now, halfway through the battle, it begins to rain and it doesn't stop. And this turns what is already a difficult battlefield into a quagmire. And, you know, one of the most famous passages or descriptive passages that's been written about the battle by Eugene Sledge, who was a Marine fighting there in his second campaign, was, I mean, he describes the death and destruction all around him, the putrefaction of corpses. They couldn't actually remove the corpses of the battlefield. It reminds you, frankly, of the First World War. There are body parts, the smell, the piss, the blood. I mean, it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. And worst of all, again, like the First World War, these lines do not move very fast and very far. And as a result, they're literally sitting in what he described as a cesspool of hell. One of the greatest tragedies of the battle is the fate of the Okinawan civilians. There were initially, when the battle starts, 375,000. The Japanese have made a vague attempt to evacuate some of them, not many. They've also tried to move some of them to the north, again, not many. The majority are still in the southern third of the island, which was the most populous bit of the island, but that's where the Japanese have got their defenses. The Japanese had used them rather ruthlessly to help with their constructing their defensive formations, and they have very little human feeling for the fate of the Okinawans. They have told them, and this is part of the problem, that if the Americans win the battle and they fall into the hands of the Americans, they will be killed and raped. And as a result of that, a sizable proportion of the total number of Okinawan civilians who die in the battle, and that total number is a scarcely believable 125,000. A sizable number of that actually killed themselves or were killed by the Japanese. They were not killed in the middle of the battle by accidentally, as it were. They took their own lives. one of the most horrific passages in the book is a description of a 15-year-old Okinawan boy describing killing his mother and his brother and sister because the Japanese had persuaded him to do it. It's absolutely heartbreaking. Some of the worst stories in relation to Okinawan civilians happened towards the end of the battle, actually, when it's almost over, and a lot of the Japanese soldiers who aren't in captivity at that point have been given orders just to act as guerrillas, and they're trying to get through the American lines, and trying to get through American lines at night when they're likely to be fired on. One of the methods they use is to send civilians out ahead of them. Of course, they'd all get mowed down, and then they would try and take the opportunity after that to get through. But they were utterly ruthless. There are examples in the book of the Japanese hiding in caves, and of course, you know, they've been hiding in caves through most of the battle. And if there were Okinawan civilians in the caves with them and they were making any noise, they would murder the children, or they would send them out to die outside if there was an air raid, if there was artillery fire going on. So, you know, some of the worst descriptive passages I've ever seen about the treatment of civilians occurred during this battle. The Americans were not angels during the battle by any stretch of the imagination. They quite quickly got to the point where they were unwilling to take prisoners. That's not to say they didn't. They did. About 7,000 were eventually taken of the 110,000. But pretty much all the rest of the Japanese servicemen on that island refused to surrender and either committed suicide or fought to the death. The Americans weren't angels, but on the whole, their treatment of Okinawan civilians, despite what the Japanese had warned, was very encouraging. They fed them, they tended to them, they put them in places where they were safe, and still today there are Okinawan civilians who remember that fondly, even if they're not over delighted at the presence of US servicemen still on the island today. There was an opportunity reasonably early on in the battle for the Americans to have done something different, apart from, you know, slowly moving forward, using artillery, using firepower, using napalm, using bombs to work their way through these very formidable positions. They could have launched an amphibious operation, a second landing behind the Japanese lines. Buckner, the commander, he was advised to do that by his subordinates, particularly his Marine subordinates who were used to that sort of operation, and he refused to take that option for various reasons. I think it was a mistake. We'll never know for sure. It's a counterfactual. But given that he himself acknowledged that it was going to be a long, hard slog, why not try something different? And we do know from Japanese sources that the one thing they were really concerned about was a second landing, but he never took that opportunity, and therefore this slow, steady grind through these incredibly formidable defenses took its toll on American lives. 12,500 American servicemen were lost in this battle, which is the most severe losses of Americans in any battle during the Second World War, and some of their most costly in their military history. When they'd finally got through the final line, the so-called Shuri line that extended from Naha through the old imperial capital of Shuri, they withdrew to the south of the island. And again, there was another opportunity by Buckner to prevent that withdrawal. He didn't take it, despite intelligence suggesting that they might be about to do that. And therefore, they got to a final redoubt at the bottom of the island. And more tough fighting had to go on until finally, after 83 blood-soaked days and some of the most savage fighting I've ever read about and certainly written about, they were able to take possession of the bottom of the island. There's a little bit more mopping up to go, but by the 22nd of June, the battle was finally over. What's most significant about Okinawa, and it's an unintended consequence, is the effect it had on the thinking of senior American political and military figures. So you've got Truman in Washington thinking, okay, we've now conquered Okinawa, where are we going to go next? And therefore he holds a meeting just a few days before the battle ends of his senior advisors in Washington, and he says, what next? You know, how do we defeat Japan? And they say, well, we're planning to invade Japan proper. We're going to do it in the autumn and the spring of 1946. That was their planning. Up to 2 million men are going to be involved. but we're going to take an awful lot of casualties. We know we're going to take an awful lot of casualties because look what's happened on Okinawa. It hugely affected their thinking. They knew that however toughly the Japanese had fought on Okinawa, you can multiply that when you get to the home islands proper. Not only because there are many more troops there and many more civilians there, this is effectively the last redoubt. They are going to fight tooth and nail there. We know that even the civilians were being trained to attack American soldiers as and when they landed on Japan proper. And Truman was in no doubt, and his advisors were in no doubt, that there would be enormous casualties when they finally got to the home islands. How many, we don't know, but up to 1 million and maybe more. Churchill was convinced of that as well, and it's interesting that people often forget there was going to be a sizable British contingent taking part in the so-called Operation Downfall, which is the 2 stages of the attack on Japan. So what Okinawa ultimately did is it concentrated minds, and at that crucial meeting at which Okinawa had been mentioned, Truman says, is there another option to invasion? And that, of course, was the use of atomic weapons. What we've also got to remember is they didn't know if they're going to work, and it took another month to finally test them, by which time Truman's in Europe at the Potsdam Conference, and when he receives the information that the nuclear weapons are actually going to work, the decision pretty much has already been taken. He tells Churchill, and Churchill writes afterwards, I don't understand what all the fuss is about, the debate about the use of nuclear weapons. No single advisor, political or military, in any of the Allies was in any doubt that that was the right thing to do. Without it, we would have faced an absolute bloodbath. And not only, and this is the important point that Truman always felt stressing, appalling as it seems to justify the dropping of 2 atomic weapons, Truman himself was well aware and wrote about this many times that not only would it save hundreds of thousands of American and British lives, it was also going to save probably millions of Japanese lives, both servicemen and civilians. It's harsh to do a to do a literal totting up of dead, but the number of dead, we don't know for sure, but the number of dead under those 2 atomic weapons probably doesn't even equal the 250,000 who were killed on Okinawa, let alone the millions who would have died in Japan. When I look at all the theatres of war that I've studied and all the wars and the consequences of those wars, and there are never no consequences for combat soldiers, I have never seen a series of diaries, letters, first-hand accounts that compare to those from Okinawa that leave you in no doubt that the legacy of the war, of the nature of the fighting, was going to remain with these soldiers for the rest of their lives. I would say that the Pacific in general was a far more severe place to fight than for Allied soldiers in the Mediterranean or northwest of Europe, but Okinawa was an exaggerated version of that for the soldiers who fought there. And again, I come back to Eugene Sledge, who was a very bright man. He went on to become a university professor in biology. He was very successful in his field, but he hardly had a night for the rest of his life, having returned to America in late 1945, in which he didn't have nightmares, in which he wasn't tormented in one way or another by what he had gone through. He finally writes his book, With the Old Breed, about his time as a way of sort of, making sense of it as some kind of expiation or some kind of way for him to exorcise the demons. I don't think he ever truly managed to exorcise those demons. He is a man who put his thinking into words in that book, particularly at the end of that book is incredibly moving. But every serviceman who fought in the front line, in particular on Okinawa, was not unaffected by it. And just to give you a very quick statistic to underline that, of the 70 to 75,000 American casualties in the battle, wounded and killed, a third of those were combat fatigue, battle fatigue, PTSD as we would call today. They simply couldn't go on fighting in those sort of conditions. It was absolutely brutal.
Well, I'm dressed as a lander. This takes you right back to the beginnings of the 18th century, and smuggling was rife all along the south coast of Britain. One of the major products everybody knows about is obviously brandy, which, coming from just across the channel there via the Channel Islands, brandy was an extremely precious cargo. It was bought in a very high percentage and then cut with water and other things, including caramel, to give it its distinctive brown colour, and was then sold on to market right across the country. Why were they doing this? To avoid the horrendous taxes. In the early 18th century, Britain declared war on Spain and therefore needed revenue. The best way to do that was to put tax on special goods that were, I suppose, value added. So the brandy itself, whilst very valuable, was of course very difficult to move. You can imagine the weight of gallons of brandy bought in specially constructed casks for smugglers, known as half anchors, 4.5 gallons. A man was expected to carry 2 of those for miles inland, having landed them here. But why is this place special? This place is called the Fleet Lagoon. It's brackish water, and in the far distance you can see the Great Bank of Chesil. A dangerous coast in the best of times, but in storms lethal. Smugglers used the fishing boats that fished for mackerel, known as lerrets. They rowed out into the channel to the passing ships. They did the deal with the money exchanged for goods, brought them to the bank, brought them over the top, and then flat-bottomed boats called trows were rowed across the fleet. Now, if the person on this side, the lander, saw that there were revenue about and wanted to avoid falling into a trap, they would use lights, normally from candles, and they would only shine a light when it was safe. That meant that the trow would come right across here, land the cargo on the beach. If it was unsafe, they would literally dump the cargo in the water and it would float beneath the surface and it would be picked up on another day. So the goods that we have here are typical of the time that replaced brandy and other luxuries such as tea. May sound ridiculous, but eventually this went up to 119% tax, which made it out of the reach of most people. 5 shillings a pound, which was a fortune back in the 18th century. How do you stop the smuggling of tea? Obvious, reduce the tax, which they did after the war against the Spanish ended. But the revenue was still needed to run the country. And when the American War of Independence came up, how were they going to raise the tax? In 1873, William Pitt the Younger became the new Prime Minister, leading a coalition government. And what then happened was he reduced the tax on tea even more, and to increase the revenue, he decided to tax windows. This is where we get the term daylight robbery from. So if you can imagine Georgian houses, great big windows, they counted the amount of windows and they charged you for the daylight. What do you do with that? Well, to get around the tax, of course, you board the windows up or brick them up. So that's why we see many Georgian houses with false windows with bricks replaced, avoiding the tax. Problem? Dark. So what do? We use candles to light the rooms. That allows us to extend the hours of work and replaces the daylight. So what does Pitt do? He increases the candle tax. So what do we do then? Well, we turn to an ancient medieval idea, something called a rushlight. That's a rush gathered from a pond, and then the wax within the stem is then dipped in tallow, which is a fat when you cook meat, and you can light it, but it doesn't give off a very good light. So they used to light both ends to give more light. Obviously, it would consume the rushlight quicker, but at least you could work longer into the evening and during the day as well. That's where we get the term burning the candle at both ends. It means you're working far too hard. So all of this stuff would have been bought individually, either in large amounts or in small packets, delivered to the coastline, and then it was the lander's responsibility, that's myself, to organise the gangs to move it up into the safe houses and allow the onward transportation over to the cities. There wasn't such a thing as a huge ordnance survey map at the time, but I do have an example here of a road map. And this road map only shows the road and the countryside for about 1/4 mile either side. This is the thing that gives us the smuggling routes. We know exactly where they went. And for those of you that are missing the Chalke Valley History Festival, there is a place called Chettle House on the road from Blandford on this map, which is where this stuff was taken for onward transmission to the great markets of the southern part of England. But this isn't only Dorset. Other places all around the coast were involved in smuggling operations. The famous gangs of Sussex and Kent, the Hawkhurst gang, a vicious bunch of criminals, even they were caught finally by the revenue and executed. But the penalty for smuggling was not great enough to stop it. They just couldn't cut the entire smuggling out until finally, in the late 18th and 19th century, the tax on various products was reduced to almost nothing. So from 119% on tea to 12.5% meant it just wasn't worthwhile smuggling tea anymore. And so the smuggling trade died out.
Hello, my name's Ali Ansari, and I've been involved now with the Chalke Valley History Festival for the last couple of years. And I very much regret that this year, because of our short excursion to the Middle Ages with this pandemic, that I won't be able to indulge in what is proving to be an annual pilgrimage to the festival. But instead, I've been asked to give some ideas, very short video really on my current research, which I'm happy to do. And I've been looking really at travellers between Iran and Britain in the early 19th century. And so far, most people really have looked at travellers from Britain to Iran, and there are a great many of those accounts, histories, travelogues, observations and others. But relatively few people have looked at the reverse, basically Iranians coming to Britain in the 19th century, particularly in the early 19th century, and the observations they had. And it's fascinating on a number of different levels, but one clearly being the way in which, how the Iranians what impressions they had of this country in the aftermath, particularly of the Napoleonic Wars, and what they came away with. And the person I'm looking at in particular is a gentleman that came over with the first batch of students, so to speak, that were sent over after the Battle of Waterloo, in actual fact, and was sponsored by a number of British individuals who came to look and learn and see what they could take back with them about the achievements of Britain at this time. And one of these students was a gentleman by the name of Mirza Saleh, and his task was really to acquire the secret really of Britain's success by looking at aspects of scientific development, but also history. And he wrote a wonderful travel log. He didn't spend much time going around the entirety of the island of Great Britain, but he really spent most of his time in the south, in England. He had acquired a facility in English, certainly, although sometimes some of the words that he produces are very much just as he heard them, and it's been quite difficult to sort of translate and work out what he was saying. But what's particularly interesting about it is he clearly engaged with people in Britain at the time who provided him with a history of Britain and a history of England. And this is actually in many ways a thoroughly Whiggish history. It's very striking that this is the first history in the Persian language of Britain as understood by the Brits themselves at the time, and the way he sought to try and develop this and articulate it, but also comment on various aspects of it, how he understood it, how he understood particularly the various scientific achievements. So you see, I think for the first time in the Persian language, a history of Britain from the Romans all the way to his present, certainly the post-Napoleonic period, charting various scientific developments that have occurred, various achievements, various social developments, political developments and others. And it's very interesting to see the emphasis they place on this growth of the idea of liberty and the importance that gives to making Britain the great power. Mirza Saleh then returned to Iran and brought with him the first printing press, in actual fact, and he was basically the father of the newspaper in Iran, though it took many, many years for it to subsequently develop. But he's a fascinating character, and I hope to be able to talk to you in more detail about him at a later date when we can all get back together in that wonderful festival at Chalke Valley.
Well, all profits we make from the Chalke Valley History Festival are ploughed back into the Chalke Valley History Trust, and this was set up specifically to further the enjoyment and interest in history to all ages, but particularly to children. And actually the Schools Festival that we hold each year, but sadly haven't been able to do this year, is a key part of what we do. We're not in it for the money, we are in it to further the understanding of history. It's one of my biggest regrets that we haven't been able to hold it this year, but it will be back. In the meantime, for now, good night and see you tomorrow.
It's wonderful. We came here last year with my family and just love the fact that it's living history and it's actually experiencing history rather than talking about it in a classroom and looking at pictures in a book, which will be good, but we love being here and it's really great for the children that they're absorbing the atmosphere.
The core aim of the Trust is to promote the education and enjoyment of history for people of all ages. So our main festival does that, of course, for adults, but what we really wanted to do when we set up the Trust was to make sure that we gave school children the best possible understanding of history in a really fun and enjoyable atmosphere.
They're loving it. The weather is helping too, and getting around to see the different workshops and different kind of lectures that are going on.
We found this sort of like-minded community of radical dissenters.
It's a feast of history. There is history from every period. We've got a group of 50 boys here, and they are very, very engaged.
Perfect.